Okay, this is my problem. Whenever anyone says the law is the law and you just got to follow the law. Okay, why is the law the law? Because if something is grossly improper, then it should be illegal. Welcome to 2Girls1GarbageCan, the Auspol podcast where we discuss the garbage can state of Australian politics through a historical lens of what came before so we can try and better understand what the fuck is going on right now. I'm your host, Tamara.
And I'm Matty. We're jumping back to 1983. Just after Brian Burke became Premier, Laurie Connell, who helped him set up the John Curtin Foundation, advised the state Labor government on the purchase of Northern Mining from Alan Bond's Bond Corp for approximately $12 million. In today's money, $45.5 million over its actual value. At the same time that he was acting as an advisor to the state government in this sale, Connell was also acting on behalf of Bond Corp, which is a fact that Premier Brian Burke knew but kept secret from Parliament.
He advised them to spend $43 million over and above what it was worth. He was also working for Bond Corp, who they were purchasing, who he advised to purchase, and our Premier knew all of this.
And hid it intentionally from Parliament.
Again, anyone who doesn't understand why anarchy is the only way to go, that's our money. That's our money.
Yeah, that's our money. That's the West Australian people's money that was being used to make that purchase.
Our money, and this is why I call it money laundering. I call it money laundering, and people turn around and say, well, you can't use that term. That means something. And I said, and what is this?
Yeah.
What is this? Alan Bond gives them nearly $1 million, and so they give him $43 million of our money? All cool and normal.
Early in his term as Premier, Burke was approached by the developers of the Argyle Diamond Mine. They claimed to have an agreement with the O'Connor Liberal government that their obligation to build a town at the mine would be waived if the coalition had won the 1983 election. Burke decided to allow the waiver to go ahead, provided that the government be compensated by $58 million. The government then spent $42 million of that $58 million to buy a 5% stake in the mine from Northern Mining, which was the company owned by Alan Bond. Burke later said, that showed me that revenue raising could be done.
At the expense of the Australian people.
Yeah. Apparently this deal was basically the introduction of fly-in, fly-out work in Australia, and it was said at the time that the social implications of the deal are pretty ugly. After this deal went through, Burke held a meeting with several federal government MPs, including John Dawkins, Kim Beazley and Peter Walsh, where he pitched the idea of becoming a state capitalist to help with the state's financial situation. As I said before, it was later revealed in the WA Inc. Royal Commission that Connell was a paid advisor to both Burke and Bond during the deal's negotiations. The Royal Commission found that Burke had known about Connell advising Bond, but had deliberately chose not to tell his cabinet colleagues. And they called it grossly improper conduct, but did not find it to be illegal.
Okay, this is my problem. Whenever anyone says the law is the law and you just got to follow the law. Okay, why is the law the law? Because if something is grossly improper, then it should be illegal. Because, I don't know, I don't think stealing food if you're starving is grossly improper, but that's illegal. I do find interfering with small children grossly improper. Glad that's illegal. If you're going to call something grossly improper, it should definitely be illegal then, right? Like, that's why we have laws. to try and put controls on behaviour that we don't
On
like?
improper behaviour. And
Gross
grossly
and improper behaviour?
improper behaviour. Yeah. Uh-huh. In June of 1983, Burke announced a number of measures designed to improve West Australia's finances. Gas and electricity prices were raised for consumers by an average of 15%. Water prices increased by 7.9%. Housing Commission rents rose by 10%. Bus fees increased by 5%. Rail and road coach fares increased by 10%. And hospital bed charges rose between 11.5 and 19%. These cost increases were expected to gain the government $60 million for the upcoming budget. He also announced pay cuts for senior public servants, politicians and the judiciary, and that 1,000 government jobs would be removed, saving $15 million. The tribunals that usually set salaries were bypassed as these changes were done via an Act of Parliament. Although the Public Service Union described this as lunacy, the general public approved of the pay cuts, which overshadowed the cost increase. A Morgan Gallup poll taken as Burke announced the charge increases and salary cuts showed Burke to be Australia's most popular Premier at the time, with an approval rating of 72%.
That's insane.
Yep.
That's insane. How could he be taking... Because the West Australian government is the largest... Well, is it the largest employer in Western Australia?
I think so.
Editing Tamara here. Yeah, in fact, the Western Australian government is the largest employer in Western Australia. There you go.
Besides Woodside, who's actually the West Australian government. But how could they have cut that many jobs and had no one have anything to say about it? That many people's wages. I'd have no one have anything to say about it.
Basically, during the period from 1983 until the stock market crash of 1987, the West Australian Development Corporation, WADC, which was the pivotal part of WA Inc., because you have to understand WA Inc. was something that the public and the media termed it.
Yes.
The WADC was the actual enterprise that caused all of these issues. So basically, during that time, it made a bunch of investments in different companies and corporations and things like that, trying to partner the West Australian government directly into business ties. So it was making it the West Australian government's best interest to weaken legislation that protected workers in order for its business interests to be more successful. So this is the problem that you have with government getting involved in for-profit business, is that it then becomes the government's best interest to fuck over working class people in order to make a bigger profit for the government. Okay?
Now seems like a really good time to interrupt and let you know that today's episode is brought to you by our wonderful Trash Pandas. For just $3 a month, you too can become one of our beloved Trash Pandas. Trash Pandas get access to early episodes, ad-free, no waiting a week in between drops, detailed research notes on each of our episodes as of our second season, exclusive episodes that are only for our Trash Panda members, exclusive access to live stream VODs, first access to all merch drops, plus much, much more. The link below in the show notes will take you to our Ko-fi, where you can join up to become one of our Trash Pandas, or you'll see a QR code coming past on your screen if you are watching at the moment. If neither of those options suit you, you're always welcome to search 2Girls1GarbageCan on Ko-fi, and whatever your favourite search engine will take you directly to it. Now, don't forget that our beloved Trash Pandas receive so many wonderful bonuses, and you too can be one of them for as little as $3 Aussie a month. Can you believe that for such a low, low price, you receive so many wonderful bonuses? Now, don't forget, just by liking, subscribing, and sharing this episode that you're listening to with 5 of your closest friends, you'll be doing a world of good for our community, and we will love you dearly. So if you're not up for becoming a Trash Panda, there are still many, many ways that you can help us by liking, subscribing, and of course, giving us 5 stars and leaving us one of those glowing comment things. We love you all, and now back to the episode.
This is also why I get really frustrated, though, when we give KPIs to frontline workers in government agencies. Because when people say big market or big government, which one do you want? It's that the bigger the market is, the bigger we need the government to control the market.
Because government is meant to be the opposing side of the coin to industry.
Yeah.
You're meant to have industry on one side, government on the other, and they're meant to work as counter levers against each other.
When you have people who say that they want small government, especially the people on the right, they'll say that they want small government. What they mean is they want small government protections. They want no government intervention. They want laissez-faire capitalism.
Less taxes, less intervention.
It just, when it comes to the economy, it just frustrates the shit out of me, because we really, whenever anyone starts talking about it in terms of how important it is, I'm like, you haven't studied political science.
Yeah. Or economics. We're not quite at 1987 yet. 1987 is where everything truly goes to shit, but we're going to discuss a few more things that happened before then.
Yeah, okay.
Now, I mentioned earlier that in his role as the treasurer, Burke had the statutory capacity to direct the financial affairs of both the SGIC and the Superannuation Board.
Excellent.
Which would become later SGIO and GESB. Okay.
Yeah. So these are our state insurance and our state superannuation
State Government
fund.
Workers Superannuation Fund.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I did say that in 1987, new powers were granted that allowed him to use the funds from both of those for any purpose that was approved by the treasurer, which was also him.
All those checks and balances.
Oh, there's more checks and balances out the window, bub. Burke was also able to control the day-to-day operations and decisions made by those bodies through the appointment of entirely unqualified but compliant friends to senior positions. People that he elevated included Tony Lloyd, a local government clerk who became the assistant under-treasurer, and then the commissioner of SGIC and chairman of GESB. Kevin Edwards, a trade union official who became head of the Premier's Department and a board member of both SGIC and GESB. And Len Brush, the husband of Burke's private secretary, who became the chairman of GESB and also held a West Australian Development Corporation managerial position. So he had people installed into positions of power within both GESB and SGIC so that he could also have direct control over the day-to-day.
Fucking hell.
So the central Perth property and development transactions that were entered by the WADC between 1984 and the stock market crash in 1987 were part of the specific term of reference of the WA Inc. Royal Commission. These included the David Jones site, which in early 1985, the Central Perth former site of David Jones Department Store was owned by the Midtown Property Trust, a unit trust in which the units were held by or on behalf of the Bond Corporation and Laurie Connell. It was offered for sale to the Superannuation Board, which contracted to spend $11,175,000 on a 50% interest in a joint redevelopment venture. However, the Superannuation Board was to bear the entire cost of the project, making an elaborate loan to materialise Midtown's share of the expenses. When the agreement was drafted in April of 1985, the two parties were also planning to secure the title to the Perth Technical College site. So, the Perth Technical College site was 1.15 hectares, 2.8 acres, of Crown land in a prime central location on the main street, St. George's Terrace, opposite the David Jones site. In May of 1984, Burke requested that the WADC manage development of the site, on which stood one important heritage building, the 1910 Technical School that was designed by Hilson Beasley. Proposed demolition of all buildings on the St. George's Terrace site was announced in 1985 by a state government agency, the WADC, with the extraordinary support of the National Trust of Australia WA branch to facilitate major redevelopment tenders. However, Brian Burke was persuaded to order preservation of the 1910 building only following a public campaign that was waged by a pressure group, the Castle Keepers. In February of 1985, the large site, including the various other college buildings, was valued at $19 million of 1985 money. In 1986, Laurie Connell and Alan Bond, through his Bond Corporation, both bought 25% stakes in a larger amalgamated site, which included Newspaper House, the Royal Insurance Building, and the 1890s WA Trustee Co building, in partnership with the State Superannuation Board. The consortium paid $33.5 million for the site. 2 years later, it was sold to Kerry Packer and Warren Anderson, who paid $270 million for it, and had grand plans to build on what they now called Westralia Square. In the early 1990s, plans for a $2 billion development by Indonesia's Sama Group fell through, and Anderson left the project, with Packer selling his investment in 2003 for $19 million, taking a loss of more than $200 million on the deal. It was purchased by a partnership of Multiplex and Rick Stowe, who we mentioned earlier.
Fucking hell.
To give you an idea, on the Westralia Square deal, the West Australian state government at the time was estimated to have lost $74 million in 1988 money. Then we also have Central Park. It now hosts a 51-storey office tower, the one with the Rio Tinto branding on top of it. There was a planned $150 million redevelopment of the site that was announced in October of 1985 as part of the WADC. The plans included a 45-storey office tower, underground car parking, landscape park, and extension of the Hay Street Mall westwards towards the development. The demolition of the site started in October 1986, by which time the planned tower had been expanded slightly to 47 floors. The 1987 approval of the redevelopment by Perth City Council was controversial. The council's own town planning scheme imposed a limit on the number of parking bays in the central business district to ensure that city streets could handle increased traffic levels from extra parking. Under the scheme, the site was only entitled to 300 parking bays. However, the developers sought approval for nearly 1,200. It's almost 4 times the amount, which council planning experts said would cause traffic to back up to King Street waiting for entry. The council wanted developers to consider constructing a road tunnel from Mounts Bay Road. On the Central Park property redevelopment, WADC lost $100 million of 1988 money. And then we have got Rothwell's. Let's get on to Rothwell's and also the Kwinana petrochemical plant.
Oh, Kwinana, this is going to be good. So far we're up to 2 different investment schemes that have gone sideways.
Yep.
That they've lost millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of our money.
Nearly $200 million just on these 2 things.
Just nearly 200?
1987 money, by the by. So let me just calculate this out to today's money.
We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars.
Today, $470 million just on those 2 projects.
They were just throwing around all of this money.
Yep.
All at once.
Yeah, both of these developments, Westralia and Central Park, occurred at exactly the same time. So
if anyone is not familiar with Perth, you would be forgiven for not being familiar with Westralia. You'd be forgiven for not being familiar with it if you live in fucking Perth, okay? If you take the wrong turn when you're coming out of the bus station, if you take the wrong turn and you don't go right the way everyone else goes and you go left, you'll accidentally find yourself in West Australia and you'll have no fucking clue how to get out of there. And somehow you will get out of there. Somehow you'll find yourself in a part of the city that no one has ever walked through before, and it seems like only cars exist and there aren't any footpaths, and you'll scurry along a little bit to another section, and then suddenly you'll find yourself back in a food court area where there are other people, and you kind of look behind you, and then West Australia is gone. It didn't exist. It was like it's like you've gone through Alice in Wonderland without any of the wonder and all of the fear.
Psychedelic drugs. Like, you don't even get the benefits. You get all of the trip with none of the benefits.
It's the weirdest fucking... Nothing's ever opened in there. Nothing's ever opened in there. We're kind of selling Australia to them. Honest to God, every time you go in there, and the only reason you know it's Australia is because when you get to the wall, because there's a wall, right? There's like, you know the wall. You know the wall, Matty. You get to the wall and you have to make a decision, and there's a little plaque that says Australia on it, Australia Court or whatever it is. Yeah, but otherwise you'd have no fucking idea what it was if not for the little plaque when you get to the wall.
Agreed. So these two failures added up to 174 million in 1988 money, which is almost $500 million in today's money.
Holy shit. Okay?
So that was just two of the failures. Now we're going to talk about Rothwell's Merchant Bank and the Kwinana petrochemical plant. We will talk about the Kwinana petrochemical plant first because it kind of leads into Rothwell's. So, the petrochemical plant was a never realised plant that was proposed in the late 1980s to be developed in Kwinana. In September of 1986, Petrochemical Industries Company Limited, PICL, which is what I'll be referring to them from now on, a joint venture involving companies controlled by the property developer Dallas Dempster, who was the principal developer of Burswood Casino, and the merchant banker Laurie Connell, who's in charge of Rothwell's, proposed the development of a major petrochemical project at Kwinana, and on the 2nd of November 1987, agreements were signed by the state government-owned State Energy Commission of Western Australia and PICL, for the former to supply the latter with natural gas from the state's northwest shelf at a commercially realistic price linked to the Consumer Price Index.
Yeah.
Now, keep in mind, both Dallas Dempster and Laurie Connell had made big donations to West Australian State Labor through the John Curtin Foundation. Okay? By December of 1987, though, it was becoming apparent that Connell's merchant bank Rothwell's was no longer a viable financial institution, and Dempster had been unable to secure 100% debt finance for the project. Due to outstanding loans to Connell and Connell-associated entities, Rothwell's was short $300 million or more needed to restore its solvency and produce an acceptable balance sheet. And without these funds, Rothwell's would have to cease trading on its reporting date of the 31st of July 1988. In order to deal with Rothwell's impending crisis, a mid-1988 meeting involving representatives of the state government, Rothwell's, and Allen Bonds Bond Corp agreed that the government would give a discounted energy price and other guarantees to PICL so as to boost the company's value to $400 million. The Bond Corporation and the government would then purchase PICL for that price, $350 million to be paid to Connell so that he could repay the $300 million of debt to Rothwell's and add $50 million of liquidity and $50 million to Dempster for his share. When PICL was sold to the state government and Bond Corp, its sole real asset was a heavily mortgaged block of land in Kwinana valued at $100,000.
That the government paid how much for?
$400 million. The next bit, which conveniently leads on from the last, is we're going to talk about Rothwell's. So, as I mentioned earlier, Rothwell's began with Laurie Connell acquiring numerous local businesses through aggressive takeovers and then setting him up as a deposit taker and creating Rothwell's Merchant Bank.
Yeah.
However, immediately after the 1987 stock market crash, there was a run on the bank by local investors. Connell put together a rescue package involving numerous Australian businessmen and approached the Premier, who provided $150 million in government guarantees to provide short-term relief. Despite that, after Burke's resignation on the 25th of February 1988, the incoming Premier, Peter Dowding, was required to enter very complicated and controversial dealings in an attempt to protect the government's interests. Rothwell's ultimately went into liquidation, resulting in heavy losses to the government and Rothwell's investors. A Royal Commission later found out Mr. Dowding, as Premier, presided over a disastrous series of decisions designed to support Rothwell's when it was or should have been clear to him and to those ministers closely involved that Rothwell's was no longer a viable financial institution.
How was it?
This culminated in the decision to involve the government through WAGH in the Kwinana Petrochemical Project as a means of removing the government's contingent liability for certain of the debts to Rothwell's. Electoral advantage was preferred to public interest. The political fallout from the collapse of the bank, as well as other government dealings during the period, dominated media and political discourse during the 1990s and ultimately wound up being one of the major factors in the Royal Commission being called. In total, Rothwell's and the Kwinana Petrochemical Plant lost the West Australian state government $408 million.
That's all?
In their time. In our time, 1.1 billion.
Oh my fucking God. They won't even put $1 billion into housing, but they'll put it into their friend's failing
into a failing
business.
Bank.
They'll put it into their friend's failing bank, but not into housing their own populace. Yeah. Tell me again how this government is about the people. Tell me again how Labor is about the people. Fuck off.
Yeah, right. Then we have the final bit, which was Bell Group. So this is where Alan Bond comes into play. So Bell Group, as I mentioned earlier, was owned by Robert Holmes-a-Court.
Hang on a second. You're telling me that we've already lost, in today's money, $1.6 billion?
Yeah, 1.6 billion. Yeah.
In today's money, and we haven't
a bit more
even
than
got
that, actually.
1.7? Sorry, my maths is not that
nearly
great.
$2 billion. Yeah.
Nearly $2 billion in today's 1.7. I was going to say 1.7, and I was like, no, that's I'm rounding too high on that one. Now, there you go. I should have trusted myself. So we got $1.7 billion in losses for the West Australian people at this point. Mm-hmm. And Alan Bond's barely even entered the picture. He's
hasn't
just
even
on the
appeared
periphery.
yet. He's the only things that he's been a part of is that he was involved in the purchase of Kwinana Petrochemical Plant.
And he was also part of the John Curtin donations. So he's been donating money to the Labor Party. He's been part of the group.
Yes.
But he's only been periphery involved, and we've already lost nearly $2 billion.
Correct. All of these things that are happening was gambling with people's pensions. All of this money, by the time of the October 87 international stock market crash, Bell Group, which was owned by Holmes-a-Court, had accumulated assets that were valuable but weren't generating revenue that was sufficient to cover their debts.
Yeah.
Holmes-a-Court's family company, Heytesbury Holdings, at the time owned 43% of Bell Group, which in turn owned 40% of the cash-rich Bell Resources. However, Bell Resources was not able to buy its parent due to share raids being made by Kerry Packer, Adelaide Steamship Company, and IEL. Merrill Lynch withdrew its $1 billion line of credit facility, meaning that the parent couldn't acquire its subsidiary and thereby access the money. Holmes-a-Court initially disposed of some of the Perth properties before accepting a joint takeover by the Bond Corp and the State Government Insurance Commission. in which both parties took a 19.9% stake in Bell Group. Holmes à Court retained 6% of Bell Group and received $340 million from the sale. Bond Corp was subsequently forced to bid for other shares in Bell, with the result that it ended up with a majority shareholding of 68% of Bell Group. Bond Corp then proceeded to strip $500 million from Bell Resources in an effort to prop up Bond Corp's debts. The asset stripping included transferring cash from Bell Resources Limited for its own purposes, thus breaching the company code and ultimately sending Alan Bond to jail. Transfer of ownership of newspaper holdings into Bond Media, and the disposal of certain assets, including TV West 7. The amount that was invested into Bell Group shares by the government was $155 million. They also...
Bond had already owned several newspapers on his own as well, so now he's bought a whole lot more by acquiring Bell Group.
Correct.
So none of us had any fucking idea what was going on, because the guy who owned all of the fucking news... So because he now owns all of the fucking news, he already owns the major TV network over here. We're talking about a guy who's got... He owns the government. He owns the media. Like, of course he was just playing and doing whatever the fuck he wanted.
Yep. So the SGIC acquired major stakes in the business in April, which allowed Holmes à Court, as I say, to walk away with $350 million. 2 years later, SGIC had sold off all of the stocks that it held in Bell Group at a loss of over $160 million.
Well, what's that? He's already lost more than $2 billion for us.
It actually spent $355 million.
Far out.
And lost $160 million on the sales. They also purchased, as part of the deal, unlisted bonds from Robert Holmes à Court for a price of $140 million, which were later assessed as having no value at all.
Oh.
Yep.
This is money laundering. This is what money laundering looks like.
Yeah, so they bought bonds that had no value as part of the deal. To
strip the Australian people of our money.
Yep. Finally, we're going to talk about Alan Bond for a bit, and then we'll briefly discuss what happened with the Royal Commission, and we'll be good to go.
I feel like Alan Bond can be his whole own episode, in all honesty. Guy is a motherfucker. He could be.
In 1987, Bond paid $1 billion to purchase the Channel 9 television network from Kerry Packer. The price was actually $1.05 billion, I should say. $800 million in cash and $255 million in subordinated debt in Bond Media. When Bond went bankrupt, Packer was able to turn the debt into a 37% equity in Bond Media, which now included Channel 9 in Brisbane, and was worth about $500 million. It was valued at $1 billion, but had $500 million worth of debt on the books. So he got it at a steal. Because he turned his $250,000 worth of debt into $1 billion worth of equity. In 1992, Bond was declared bankrupt after failing to repay a $194 million personal guarantee for a loan on a nickel mining project. His debts reportedly totaled $1.8 billion of 1992 money. He feigned brain damage to avoid answering questions during bankruptcy trials. In 95, his family bought him out of bankruptcy, with creditors accepting a payment of $12 million. A little over half of a cent per dollar owed.
I really wish I could accrue $1.9 billion worth of debt.
Yeah.
Like, I wish I had the ability to accrue that kind of debt.
Yeah, right.
Just... Holy shit. Jesus fucking Christ.
So finally we come to the Royal Commission.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've lost $2 billion of West Australian public's money. And then on the 19th of November 1990, Carmen Lawrence, the sitting Liberal Premier at the time, the then Labor Premier, I should say. So Labor was still in power somehow here. I'm assuming because Brian Burke retired in disgrace, announced her government's intention to hold a royal commission to inquire into certain matters. The decision followed more than a year of strong public advocacy from the activist group People for Fair and Open Government, headed by the Premier's brother, a barrister by the name of Bevan Lawrence, the Professor Emeritus Martin Webb, and prominent political scientist Paddy O'Brien. O'Brien edited the Burke Ambush, which was subtitled Corporatism and Society in Western Australia, which was the first substantial expose of Burke's pro-corporate government. The Commission of Three was headed by Jeff Kennedy, joined by Sir Ronald Wilson and Peter Brinsenden, with a brief to inquire and report whether there had been corruption, illegal conduct, improper conduct, or bribery on any part of any person or corporation in the affairs, investment decisions, and business dealings of the Government of Western Australia or its agencies.
Just a little question. Just a quick little small question. Just a little one. Been any corruption going around here? Been any impropriety? Maybe a little bit of dodgy dealings? Maybe some dodgy financial misconduct?
Not according to the Royal Commission.
What the fuck?
In the introductory part of its report, the Commission noted that it had heard from 543 witnesses encompassing 847 appearances. There were, however, some who may have been able to give valuable information to the Commission who died before the Commission hearings commenced or after they had begun. There were others who were unwilling to assist and were beyond the reach of compulsory process. The following had died or been incapable to attend on health grounds: Peter Beckwith of the Bond Corp, Bill Burgess of Rothwells, Robert Holmes of Court, Thomas Hugel, Bruce Kirkwood of Sequa, Andrew Mensaris, a former Liberal State Minister, another couple of people from Rothwells. Yossi Goldberg declined to give evidence. A couple of people from the Bond Corp fled. A doctor named Dr. Sharan Oscar was serving a 6-year prison term in the UK. So, after... Yeah. He was already in jail. Yeah. After approximately 21 months of inquiries and hearings, the Commission's final report began. The Commission has found conduct and practices on the part of certain persons involved in the government in period from 1983 to 1989, which were such as to place our governmental system at risk. Unfortunately, some of that conduct and some of those practices were peculiar to Western Australia, but there is no reason to believe that many of the fundamental questions raised by our inquiry were unique to this period or to this state. On the contrary, as detailed studies in other states and overseas clearly demonstrate, they have been raised elsewhere as a consequence of events similar to those which we have experienced. Some ministers elevated personal or party advantage over their constitutional obligation to act in the public interest. The decision to lend government support to the rescue of Rothwells in October of '87 was principally that of Mr. Burke as Premier. Mr. Burke's motives in supporting this rescue were not related solely to proper governmental concerns. They derived in part from his well-established relationship with Mr. Connell, chairman and major shareholder of Rothwells, and from his desire to preserve the standing of the Australian Labor Party in the eyes of those sections of the business community from which it had secured much financial support.
It starts with, there's some stuff in here that's a bit dodgy and seems really particular to WA, but we don't think this is a problem unique to WA. And we don't think it's particularly even a problem, to be honest.
No, it doesn't.
What? Can we just take that one more time? Because that doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. Let's get to the outcome. So the Royal Commission cost $30 million, including $12.5 million in witness costs. Of the witness costs, $3.6 million was used to fund Burke's own legal fees and those of David Parker. Burke's legal fees were $1.71 million, and David Parker's were 1.92 million. Burke and his predecessor, the Liberal Premier Ray O'Connor, ultimately served prison sentences as a result of convictions which arose from findings of the Commission. Now, neither of those prison sentences, by the way, were related to the loss of funds. They were instead related to improper spending that was found while they were digging around what had happened.
How they spent the stolen money.
The Premier immediately after Burke, being Peter Dowding, and the Public Service Len Brush were both found to have acted improperly. WADC Corporation's remit was reduced over time and finally wound up in 1998.
The Royal Commission decided that all of this was perfectly fine and legal and above board. Crime is a social construct because we have 10-year-olds in solitary confinement for stealing food. Yep. And these guys are wandering around perfectly happy, perfectly fine. Meanwhile, what this resulted in was a loss of billions of dollars in people's superannuation funds and insurances. This was a loss of thousands of people had to return to work in their old age. Thousands of people completely had their super wiped out at the point when they were at the very nearing retirement. The Royal Commission decided that all of this was perfectly fine and legal and above board. We literally had a property developer as a premier.
Yep.
Call it normal in WA.
Alrighty. So that is everything I've got. Thank you so much for joining us for this week's dive into the depths of the trash fire that is Australian politics. If you've enjoyed what you've seen, please make sure to drop us a follow and do all the usual engagement things to help us get the word out there. You can find Tamara and myself on the social media links in the description below, but for now, it's garbage day, so the girls gotta take the trash out. Bye.
Bye.
Bang.